The US are sending tankers of diesel to Australia. Now, this is a list of every fuel tanker currently on its way to Australia. And yes, you heard correctly, things are so grim for Australia right now that it suddenly makes sense for tankers to be sent nearly halfway round the world. Not even from the west coast of the US. That wouldn't be quite so insane. These ships are coming from Louisiana through the Panama Canal to Australia, carrying much needed diesel supplies. Now, to be clear, they're not sending us crude oil that we would have to refine ourselves. We don't have the spare refinery capacity. They're sending us ready to use fuels that can go straight into our pumps. Thank you very much, America. Now, President Trump has said that he plans to make the US an energy superpower. And he's accomplishing that as we speak, although not perhaps in the way that any of us would have imagined. If you think the energy situation is bad here in Australia, spare a thought for the EU, where they have well and truly screwed themselves by shutting down Germany's nuclear reactors and cutting themselves off from Russian oil and gas. And now, with Qatar dramatically reducing their LNG production due to damage from Iran and the Straits of Hormuz being effectively closed by the military uncertainty restricting global oil supplies by nearly 20%, well, now the energy situation in the EU is even worse than it is here, and they are getting properly desperate. But US President Donald Trump is not one to let a good crisis go to waste, and whether you think he's a Machiavellian genius who planned it this way from the start, or whether you think he's just quick on his feet, you can't deny that he's using the current energy crisis caused by the war in Iran as the leverage that he needs to get concessions from the EU that he wouldn't have been able to get any other way. First, he's forcing the EU to finally, belatedly, sign a $750 billion US energy supply deal, which was negotiated last year, but the EU have been dragging their feet on signing. He's using the current crisis as the leverage he needs to fulfill his ambition of turning the US into a global energy superpower. And second, EU countries are now lining up to support a flotilla being sent to secure the Hormuz Strait, albeit again, belatedly and with very little military credibility. More on that in a minute. But the fact is that their precarious energy situation is forcing them to play nice with President Trump, whether they like it or not. Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister for now, tried at first to refuse to allow the US to use any UK assets in their war against Iran, but they are now being forced to backpedal. Now they're discussing the possibility of sending ships, including the UK's Type 45 destroyers with anti-missile capabilities, and he's offering to host a summit for the 22 countries who have so far signed a joint statement indicating readiness to help secure the Straits of Hormuz. Now, all of that is a radical shift in position, not only from the UK, but also from the EU, as well as other countries. And it's all because the US holds the key to their energy supplies. Again, you can decide for yourself whether Trump planned it this way or whether he's just making it up as he goes. But he is dangling up to 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil in front of the energy markets as the opening gambit, followed by a total of 750 billion US dollars in energy exports to the EU in just the next few years, in a deal that would completely reverse the EU's energy dependence on Russia and would shift the geostrategic balance of power forever. But for Australians, the question isn't the EU and their energy supplies. It's Hormuz and our diesel supplies. And the question that matters is simply this: how long before the Straits of Hormuz reopen? Because even this diesel fuel from the USA, well, that's not going to be enough, not even close to covering the shortfall that we are potentially facing. So we'll get to that question in a moment. But first, my name's Tofer3. This is the Tofer Project, and I help busy people like you to cut through the crap, make sense of the nonsense, and keep up with the world as it changes around us. I'm 100% viewer supported, and you can help me to keep the Tofer Project going by buying me a coffee via the button at toferfield.com. And click the link in the description where you'll find my best-selling books, my multi-award-winning DVDs, my t-shirts and hoodies in a range of different designs, including my original and still awesome Good People Break Bad Laws, The new 1984 design, which looks like this. I'm wearing the old one, which you can't buy anymore, but the new one says the same thing in an awesome new design. Too much 1984, not enough 1776. Then there's the bold silhouette design, the whiskey and cigars design, and the subtle street-style designs, including the Tofer3 and the Tofer3 design, both in a cool grayscale scheme. And finally, there's my TF cap and my stickers. And everything you buy will help me to keep the Tofer project going. Australia gets most of its liquid fuels from huge refineries in Asia. Thing is, these refineries get most of their crude oil from the Middle East, and therefore via the Straits of Hormuz. But interestingly, South Korea, the source of more than 1/3 of the tankers currently on their way to Australia, well, they are increasingly sourcing their crude oil from the US, as the US work to increase their energy surplus for the purpose of export and energy dominance. This is a key part of Trump's energy superpower ambitions, and I think it's a viable replacement for the previous policy of the US dollar as the petrodollar. It's one thing to make the world trade oil in American dollars, but what if you made them trade American oil? OPEC, the oil producers' economic cartel, steals the limelight when it comes to controlling the world's oil supplies. But what most people haven't fully caught up with is that the US are rapidly increasing their domestic production and are now the undisputed global number one for oil production, with a new record of over 13 million barrels a day and rising. And if Trump gets his way, US production will continue to increase, although of course that does take some time. So it's not like the US are going to be able to increase their production so fast that it saves us from the current high prices. But if they continue their push towards ever more energy production and ever increasing energy exports, well then two things will happen in time. One, energy will get cheaper globally, and that's a good thing. But also, Russia and the Middle East will no longer be able to use their energy supplies as global leverage. Instead, it'll be the US who will be the ones using energy for leverage. Which brings us back to this energy deal with the EU. A $750 billion 3-year energy deal with the US, well, that would have seemed absurd prior to the war in Ukraine. But now, after 4 years of the war in Ukraine, followed by now the war in Iran and the closing of the Straits of Hormuz for the first time in history, well, suddenly it doesn't just look like a good deal. It's kind of the only deal in town, and Trump knows that he can lean on the EU and make them sign it. Now, the deal was negotiated and agreed by the EU last year in July, but the EU have been dragging their feet on signing it, actually trying to use it as leverage against Trump. Now, Trump has made it clear to the EU now they better get this deal signed or America will find other buyers for the energy. And honestly, from an Australian perspective, it's probably ideal if the EU don't sign, because we would benefit enormously if the US pivoted to selling more of its energy into Asian markets, especially crude oil, to places like Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, which is where most of our refined fuel comes from. But I don't think that'll happen. I think the US will get their $750 billion deal signed by the EU, and with that done, Trump will have once again increased the EU's dependence on friendly relationships with the US, which is the whole point of energy leverage. And no, I haven't forgotten about the reopening of the Straits of Hormuz in all of this. All of what we've covered is just background to explain why the UK, France, Germany, and all these other countries are suddenly changing their tune on the issue of an international task force to open and secure the Straits of Hormuz. They're backflipping because, thanks to the global energy crisis, Trump now has them by the short and curlies. If they want energy, they have to keep Trump happy. But even more than that, the bottom line is if the EU hope to someday in the future no longer have to grovel to the US for their energy supplies, well, that can only happen if the Middle East energy market reopens. And the sooner that happens, the better for them. So the UK, having spent the last few weeks trying to obstruct President Trump, is now set to lead a multinational coalition to clear and secure the Straits. Now, this is great news, but it's laughable to imagine that any global coalition could do that in the absence of the United States. Yeah, the UK have their Type 45 destroyers, which do have anti-missile capabilities. Plus, the UK have minesweepers and other vessels, of course. But even with the UK, France, Germany, and Japan combined, they'll still be dependent on US Navy power and US anti-missile capabilities if they're actually going to restore confidence in the safety of shipping through the Straits of Hormuz. Trump has forced the EU and other countries into supporting this international coalition, not because the US couldn't have done it on their own. In fact, having other countries' vessels in the area probably just complicates matters from the US perspective. They didn't need them, but they've done it because forcing these countries to support the US publicly is the point. Trump has energy leverage right now, and he's using it to remind the world who's boss. He's using it not only to prop up the US petrodollar, but to pivot the entire world to using US petroleum and energy. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide whether this is what Trump had in mind from the very start, or whether he's just a very good dancer who can make the most of every situation as it arises. But regardless of what you think about that, I think it's very clear that right now the US isn't just winning the war in Iran. The war in Iran is helping the US to win the silent energy wars against China, Russia, and even against the EU. Now, finally, coming back to here in Australia, we should be grateful for US energy dominance, not least because there are a few tankers of US energy on their way to us right now. But unfortunately, the reality is these Straits of Hormuz are not going to be open for at least weeks, quite possibly a month or multiple months, by the time the EU has their summits and their meetings, then gives the orders and the ships put to sea. Yeah, it's going to be a long time before those straits are opened by the EU. So I think we should be grateful that even the fuels that we continue to get from Asia over time will increasingly be made from US crude. My name's Tofer3. This is the Tofer Project, and I help busy people like you to cut through the crap, make sense of the nonsense, and keep up with the world as it changes around you. I'm 100% viewer supported, so please help me to keep the Tofer Project going by buying me a coffee, and check out my books, DVDs, and all my merch, including the Getting Your Head in the Game Masterclass via the link in the description. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm loves you for it, and so do I. Please like, comment, subscribe, and as always, think free.